Vera pressed her 4 arms tightly around her 3 kittens in the dark cargo hold of the mining vessel called the Solace. The cold was sharp and bitter, cutting through her violet fur like invisible knives. Her bioluminescent stripes, which once glowed bright enough to light up entire rooms, had faded to barely visible wisps of pale blue light. She could feel her body growing weaker with each passing hour, and she knew her babies were suffering even more than she was. The cargo hold smelled of rust and death. Water dripped from broken pipes somewhere in the darkness, creating a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to the end. Vera had stopped counting the days a long time ago. What was the point? She knew how this story would end, and there was nothing she could do to change it. 3 cycles ago, the Valerian Collective had decided she was no longer useful. Her body had grown thin from years of hard labor in their mines. They had forced her to dig deep into the ground of their conquered worlds, extracting precious metals and rare minerals until her claws were worn down to nothing. She had worked without rest, without proper food, without any hope of freedom. And when she could no longer work fast enough to satisfy their demands, they had simply discarded her like broken equipment. They had taken her mate, Corvin, first. She remembered the day they had separated them at the slave processing center on the Valerian flagship. He had fought so hard, his 4 arms flailing against the guards, his deep growl echoing through the metal corridors. But there were too many of them, and they had beaten him until he stopped moving. Vera had never seen him again. Sometimes she wondered if he was still alive somewhere, or if the collective had simply destroyed him to make room for more slaves. Then they had come for her homeworld of Phalith, attacking without warning. The ships had arrived at night, their weapons tearing through the peaceful settlements where her kind had lived for thousands of years. Vera had been in the birthing chamber with her 3 kittens when the alarms began screaming. The other mothers had tried to hide their young in the deep caves beneath the city, but the Valorians had thermal sensors that could detect any living thing. Within hours they had captured most of her people. That was when Vera had made a choice that she would regret for the rest of her life. She had surrendered herself to the Valorians to save her kittens. She had thought, foolishly, that if she worked hard enough and obeyed their commands, they would keep her babies safe. They had promised her this, though she knew now that the promises of slavers meant nothing. Mex, her smallest kitten, lay against her chest with barely enough strength to breathe. His tiny body was warm, but it was the warmth of fever, not health. His fur, which should have been soft and glossy, was matted and dull. His golden eyes, so full of curiosity when they were born, had become empty and dull. Vera could feel his heartbeat slowing down like an engine running out of fuel. Kale and Sarah, her other 2 kittens, huddled against her 4 arms, seeking warmth and comfort that she could barely provide. They were older than Mex by only a few weeks, but they had suffered more. They had been born into captivity, never knowing the freedom of running through the crystal forests of Phalith or swimming in the bioluminescent lakes of their homeland. All they had ever known was the inside of the Solace, the cold metal walls, and the sound of their mother's heart slowly breaking. Vera had tried to keep them alive. She had rationed her own meager food portions, giving more to her babies even though her own body was starving. She had sung to them the old songs of her people, songs about heroes and magic and a time when her species had been free. She had told them stories about their father, painting pictures of a strong and brave male who loved them more than anything in the universe. But even her voice had grown weak and the stories came out in whispers now. The oxygen in the cargo hold was running out. She could feel it in the thinness of each breath, in the way her head felt light and fuzzy. The ship's life support system had failed 3 days ago. The reactor was offline and there was no one left alive to fix it. The Valorians had abandoned the Solace long ago, leaving behind only the slaves they deemed worthless. Most of them were already dead. Vera could smell the decay in the stale air. She had found their bodies when she first woke up in this cargo hold, chained to a heavy metal ring bolted to the floor. There were at least a dozen of them, scattered across the dark space, their forms slowly decomposing in the cold. She had tried not to look at them, tried not to think about what would happen to her and her kittens when their bodies joined those of the others. Vera looked down at her chains. They were made of a metal alloy so strong that even her 4 arms could not break them. The Valorians had learned long ago that her species was physically strong, so they had designed restraints that could withstand tremendous force. The chains wrapped around her wrists and ankles, connected to the floor by bolts as thick as her arm. She had tested them thousands of times over the past 3 days, pulling and straining until her muscles burned with pain. But the chains never gave. They never even bent. She closed her golden eyes and whispered an ancient prayer to the stars, a prayer her mother had taught her when she was just a kitten herself. The words came out in her native language, a sound like music mixed with the purring of a great cat. She prayed to the ancient spirits of her people, asking them to guide her baby souls to a place of peace, a place where there was no hunger, no cold, and no chains. This was the end. Vera had accepted it now. She would die here in the darkness with her 3 kittens, and no one would ever know their names or their stories. The Valorians would never answer for what they had done. The universe would never know that a mother had loved her children so much that she had sacrificed everything for them, only to fail them in the end. The cold grew deeper. The darkness grew thicker. And Vera held her babies close, waiting for the darkness to take them all. David Chin sat alone in the cockpit of his salvage ship, the Wanderer, staring at the blinking red dot on his scanner screen. The signal was faint, almost dead, but it was definitely there. A distress beacon coming from somewhere in the void, 15 light-years from the nearest inhabited space station. He had been traveling alone through this region of space for weeks, searching for abandoned ships and valuable cargo that he could sell to keep himself alive. The pay was terrible and the work was dangerous, but it was the only life he knew anymore. David had not seen another human being in 5 years. He had chosen this solitude deliberately, running away from memories that hurt too much to face. Back on Earth, he had a wife named Helen and a daughter named Sophie. They had died together from a plague that swept through their city when Sophie was only 6 years old. David had been away on a business trip when it happened, and by the time he returned, they were already gone. The house had been so quiet, so empty. Every room held a ghost. So David had sold everything he owned and bought the Wanderer, a beat-up old salvage vessel that was barely held together by repairs and determination. He had pointed the ship toward the outer reaches of known space and never looked back. Out here, far away from civilization and memory, he could pretend that his pain did not exist. He could tell himself that being alone was a choice, not a punishment. The distress beacon pulsed again on his screen. David knew that he should ignore it. Following distress signals was a good way to get killed. But something about this one pulled at him. Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe it was boredom. Or maybe, deep down, there was still a part of him that wanted to save someone even if he could not save himself. He adjusted the course of the Wanderer and began moving toward the signal. The ship groaned and shuddered as its engines pushed harder, accelerating through the cold darkness. David watched the scanner as he got closer to the source. It was a large vessel, clearly very old and damaged. The hull was scarred with burns and impacts, and several sections appeared to be completely crushed. The ship's systems were almost completely offline, but somehow, somewhere deep in its broken body, something was still sending out that desperate plea for help. David approached the ship carefully. It was called the Solace, according to the registry information he could pull from the debris of its communication systems. It had been a mining vessel once, used by the Valorian collective to extract valuable resources from conquered worlds. The Valorians were brutal and cruel, known throughout the galaxy for their disregard for life. They enslaved entire civilizations and worked them to death in their mines. The fact that this ship was abandoned told David that it had probably been stripped of anything valuable long ago. He docked the Wanderer to the Solace and put on his suit, securing his helmet and checking his oxygen levels. He had about 4 hours of air, which should be enough time to find out where that distress beacon was coming from and get back to safety. He attached a tether to his waist and stepped through the airlock into the dead ship. The corridors were frozen and silent. David's footsteps echoed off the metal walls as he made his way deeper into the vessel. Ice crystals covered everything, and in places, the air was so cold that his breath froze the moment it left his mouth. He could see signs of violence everywhere. Scorch marks from weapons fire covered the walls, and in one corridor he found skeletons drifting in the vacuum, their remains long since frozen into grotesque shapes. The distress beacon was coming from somewhere below in the cargo hold. David descended through several levels of the ship, following the signal as it grew stronger. He passed through rooms filled with mining equipment and storage containers. Everything was covered in a thick layer of frost and dust. The ship felt like a tomb, a monument to suffering and death. When David finally reached the cargo hold, he turned on all his lights and froze in shock. There, huddled in the darkness against a heavy metal ring bolted to the floor, was an alien being unlike anything David had ever seen. The creature was covered in violet fur and had 4 arms instead of 2. Its body was thin and skeletal, clearly suffering from severe malnutrition. But what struck David most was the sight of 3 small kittens pressed against the alien's chest, seeking warmth and comfort from their mother. David's breath caught in his throat. He had seen many aliens in his years of salvage work, but he had never seen anything like this. The mother's bioluminescent stripes glowed faintly, like stars hidden behind clouds. Her golden eyes opened slowly as she sensed his presence, and she tensed, ready to fight or flee despite her obvious weakness. The alien mother tried to stand, her forearms shifting protectively around her kittens. A low growl rumbled from deep in her chest, a warning sound that echoed through the cargo hold. She did not know if this human was a threat or a savior. To her, he might be just another representative of the Valerian collective, come to finish what they had started. David raised his hands slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. He had learned long ago that sudden movements could terrify a wounded animal. He took a step forward, moving slowly, his voice soft and calm when he spoke, even though he knew the alien could not understand his words. "Easy," he whispered. "I am not going to hurt you." The alien mother stared at him, her golden eyes searching his face for signs of deception or cruelty. David could see the fear in her expression, but he could also see something else. Desperation. Hope. The look of a mother who had been abandoned by the universe and had almost given up, but who still held onto a tiny fragment of the will to survive. David slowly began to walk toward them, careful not to make any sudden movements. The alien mother watched him approach, her body trembling. The three kittens made small chirping sounds, their tiny claws clicking against their mother's fur. When David was just a few feet away, he knelt down slowly, dropping to one knee so that he was at the same level as the alien family. He looked at the chains that bound the mother to the floor, heavy metal restraints that spoke of cruelty and imprisonment. He looked at the kittens, their tiny bodies barely clinging to life. And he looked at the mother's face, and in her golden eyes, he saw something that stopped his heart. He saw his wife looking back at him. He saw Helen's determination, her fierce love for her child, her refusal to give up even in the face of impossible odds. He saw Sophie's innocence and vulnerability. And in that moment, David's heart broke open like a flower blooming in the darkness. He had run from his pain for 5 years, but it had followed him all the way to this frozen cargo hold in the middle of nowhere. And now, faced with another mother's suffering, David could not run anymore. David stood in the cockpit of the Wanderer, staring at the numbers on his screen. The calculations were brutal and unforgiving. His oxygen reserves were critically low. His food stores would last maybe 3 months if he rationed carefully, eating only the bare minimum needed to survive. His water recycling system was failing and would need expensive repairs that he could not afford. The ship itself was held together by hope and determination more than by engineering. Now he was proposing to add 4 aliens to this fragile equation. A mother who weighed almost as much as a human but required different nutrients. 3 kittens who needed even more food relative to their body weight because they were still growing. The math was simple and cold and impossible to ignore. If he took them, they would all be dead in 6 weeks. If he left them, he would live. David pulled up his resource calculator again, running the numbers for the 100th time. His hands were shaking as he moved the cursor across the screen. He could take them for maybe 2 weeks. He could stretch his supplies to 3 weeks if everyone ate almost nothing. But eventually the food would run out. The oxygen would run out. And they would all suffocate together in the cold darkness of space. He had not come out here to play savior. He had come out here to die slowly and alone, in a way that seemed less painful than facing his memories. And now this alien mother had looked at him with eyes that held his wife's courage, and everything had changed. But that did not mean he could save her. That did not mean his rescue would not become their mutual destruction. David left the cockpit and walked back to the airlock. He needed to go back to the Solace and disconnect from it. That was the smart thing to do. The right thing to do from a mathematical perspective. He had already spent too much time there. He had already risked too much. He should cut the tether and drift away and try to forget what he had seen. But instead, he found himself moving through the corridors toward the cargo hold. His feet carried him back to the mother and her kittens as if they had a mind of their own, independent of his rational thoughts. When he arrived at the cargo hold, he found the alien mother exactly as he had left her, huddled in the darkness with her 3 babies pressed against her body. She looked up at him as he approached, and this time there was no fear in her golden eyes. There was something worse. There was hope. She had seen him, and she had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she and her children would not die here alone in the darkness. David knelt down beside them, and the mother made a soft churring sound, almost like purring mixed with music. She reached out one of her 4 arms and touched his suit, her claws gentle against the fabric. The kittens looked up at him with wide eyes full of curiosity and hunger and the desperate need for survival. David made his decision in that moment. It was not a logical decision. It did not make mathematical sense. It was not the action of a man who valued his own life. But it was the only decision he could live with. He pulled a cutting torch from his suit's equipment belt and began working on the chains that bound the mother to the floor. The metal was thick and corroded, and it took him nearly 2 hours of steady cutting to get through the first restraint. His arms burned with fatigue and his oxygen levels dropped steadily as he worked. The mother watched him, understanding now that this human was trying to help her. She made soft sounds to her kittens, sounds that might have been encouragement or farewell or both. When the first chain broke free, the mother stood shakily on her 4 legs, her body weak from days of captivity and starvation. David had to support her weight as he cut through the remaining restraints. His oxygen was down to 1.5 hours now. He was running out of time. He cut faster, ignoring the protests of his burning muscles. Finally the last chain fell away. The mother was free. She stood on unsteady legs, her bioluminescent stripes flickering weakly as her body struggled to adjust to having movement again. She looked at David and made a sound that was almost a sob, a cry of pain and relief mixed together. David checked his oxygen meter. 50 minutes left. He took the mother's arm and helped her move toward the airlock. She was weak and moved slowly, but she kept pace with him, driven by the knowledge that she was leaving this place of death and darkness. The 3 kittens clung to her, their tiny claws digging into her fur. They made it back to the Wanderer with minutes to spare. David helped the mother and her kittens through the airlock and into the main cabin of his ship. He sealed the inner door and activated the pressurization system. When the lights came on and the mother could see her surroundings properly for the first time, she collapsed onto the floor, her body finally allowing itself to surrender to exhaustion. David removed his helmet and began the process of disconnecting the Wanderer from the solace. His hands moved automatically through the sequence, even as his mind struggled to process what he had just done. He had committed himself to this rescue. There was no going back now. He found emergency ration packs in his storage locker and opened one carefully. The mother looked at the food with an expression of desperate hunger, but she did not eat any of it herself. Instead, she broke the protein bar into tiny pieces and gave most of it to her 3 kittens. David watched her sacrifice herself for her babies, and something inside his chest clenched painfully. He spent the next 18 hours making the Wanderer habitable for its new inhabitants. He transferred what medical supplies he had to tend to the mother's injuries and malnutrition. He fixed the heating system so the cargo hold where they would sleep would not be freezing cold. He rationed his food stores carefully, calculating the absolute minimum each of them could eat to survive. With each action, David felt something crack open inside his heart. For 5 years he had thought that caring about someone was too dangerous, that love only led to pain and loss. But watching this mother fight for her babies, watching her sacrifice everything for them, David realized that he had been wrong. Not caring was its own kind of death. It was just slower, more lonely, and infinitely more cruel. When he finally finished all the preparations, David sat in the cockpit and looked at the course he had plotted into the navigation system. It would take them 2 months to reach the nearest inhabited space station. 2 months of careful rationing, of making every calorie count, of hoping that nothing went wrong with the ship's failing systems. David input the coordinates and engaged the engines. The Wanderer began to move, leaving the Solace and its tomb of death far behind. And in the cargo hold below, a mother alien held her 3 kittens close and allowed herself, for the first time, to believe that they might actually survive. 3 weeks had passed since David pulled the alien mother and her kittens from the frozen cargo hold of the Solace. The ship's corridors had transformed into something David had never expected to experience again. They were no longer silent and empty. They were filled with life and sound and purpose. The mother's name, David had learned through patient gestures and repetition, was Vera. Her kittens were named Mex, Kale, and Sarah. Vera's body had begun to recover from the trauma of her captivity. Her bioluminescent stripes now glowed with a brighter blue light, visible even in the daylight of the ship's main cabin. Her fur, once matted and dull, had begun to regain its natural shine and softness. She was still thin, still scarred by her experiences, but she was alive. And more importantly, her kittens were thriving. Mex, the smallest kitten, had been the closest to death when David found them. The tiny creature had barely been able to move, its body ravaged by fever and starvation. But with proper nutrition and warmth, the kitten had transformed into a ball of curious energy. Mex followed David everywhere, climbing up his legs and perching on his shoulders, its tiny claws pricking through his shirt. The kitten made soft chirping sounds constantly, as if asking endless questions about this strange new world of the Wanderer. Kale and Sarah were more cautious, but they too had begun to explore. They played with each other in the corridors, their bodies becoming stronger each day. They had started to understand that this human was not a threat, but rather their savior. They would often sit with David while he worked, watching him with their golden eyes, learning to trust this being from a different world and different species. Vera had also begun to work. She understood, somehow, that this ship needed constant maintenance to stay alive. She had studied David as he moved through his repair routines, and then she had begun to help him. Her 4 arms proved invaluable in tight spaces where David's 2 arms could never reach. She could hold components in place while he welded, could stabilize pipes while he worked on the plumbing system, could carry heavy equipment that would have required David to make multiple trips. One morning, David was struggling with a stubborn coupling in the life support system. The metal was corroded and refused to budge. He had been working on it for over an hour, his hands cramping with effort. Vera appeared beside him with her usual silent grace. She gestured to him to move aside, and then she positioned 2 of her 4 arms on the coupling while using the other 2 to steady herself against the wall. With a smooth, powerful motion, she twisted the coupling free. David looked at her in amazement. She looked back at him and made a sound like laughter, a churring noise that was almost musical. She had solved the problem in seconds, using strength that David simply did not possess. But more than that, she had shown him that cooperation could accomplish what neither of them could do alone. They developed a rhythm together over the following days. David would plan the repairs needed, and Vera would help him execute them. They communicated through gestures and simple words that Vera was beginning to learn. She had started using a basic translation device that David had found in the ship's emergency supplies, and with each passing day, her understanding of human language improved. She was intelligent and quick to learn, absorbing new concepts and new words with surprising speed. One evening, David was sitting in the cockpit, checking the ship's course and fuel consumption. His expression was troubled. They were using resources faster than he had hoped. At this rate, they would have to cut rations even further if they wanted to make it to the nearest inhabited station. Vera appeared in the doorway, as she often did when she sensed that something was wrong. She placed one of her clawed hands on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort that was becoming familiar. "David," she said, her voice rough but understandable through the translator. "What troubles you?" David showed her the calculations on the screen. He did not expect her to understand the numbers, but he wanted her to know that the situation was serious. Vera studied the screen for a long moment, her bioluminescent stripes pulsing slowly as she thought. Then she made a series of gestures, pointing to different parts of the ship's systems. She was suggesting modifications. Ways to make the engines more efficient. Methods to reduce power consumption in non-essential systems. David realized with a start that Vera understood mechanical systems, perhaps from her years in the Valerian mines, working with heavy equipment and technology. Together, they spent the next 6 hours making adjustments to the Wanderer. By the time they were finished, they had extended their fuel reserves by an estimated 3 weeks. David looked at Vera and saw his wife's intelligence looking back at him. He saw his daughter's curiosity and adaptability in the kittens. And he realized that his heart, which he had thought was permanently broken, was beginning to heal. The day came when David's scanner picked up an unexpected signal. A Valerian patrol ship was moving through this region of space, scanning for escaped slaves and stolen property. David's blood went cold. If they were detected, the Valorians would board the Wanderer and recapture Vera and her kittens. They would probably kill David in the process, just as a matter of routine. He called Vera to the cockpit and showed her the signal. Her entire body went rigid. Her bioluminescent stripes flared bright with fear and anger. She made a sound that was almost a scream, a sound of primal rage and desperation. But then she took a deep breath and moved to the navigation console. She studied the patrol ship's location and the surrounding space, her golden eyes narrowing with concentration. The Kessler asteroid field was only a few light years away, a deadly region of space filled with tumbling rocks and debris left over from an ancient war. No sane pilot would try to navigate through it. Vera looked at David and pointed to the asteroid field. Then she looked at the patrol ship's trajectory. She was proposing something insane. She was suggesting that they fly directly through the asteroid field while the Valorians tried to follow. It was suicide. It was also their only chance. David hesitated for only a moment. Then he nodded and took the pilot's seat. Vera positioned herself at the navigation console, her 4 arms moving across the controls with surprising precision. She used her spatial reasoning to plot a course through the asteroid field, a path so narrow and dangerous that the Valerian ship would never be able to follow. "Go," Vera commanded. David pushed the Wanderer's engines to their maximum. The ship shuddered and groaned as it accelerated toward the asteroid field. Behind them, the Valerian patrol ship tried to match their velocity, but it was slower, less maneuverable. What followed was a dance of perfect synchronization. David piloted while Vera directed, her instincts somehow reading the deadly ballet of tumbling rock and void. They twisted and turned, weaving between massive asteroids that could have crushed the Wanderer like an empty can. The patrol ship fell further and further behind, unable to keep pace with the smaller, more agile vessel. And then, suddenly, they were through. The asteroid field fell away behind them. The Valerian ship was nowhere to be seen. They had escaped. David turned to look at Vera, and she was trembling, her stripes pulsing with the aftereffect of adrenaline. But her golden eyes held no fear anymore. Only pride. Only the knowledge that they had fought together and won. David reached over and placed his hand against hers, his 5 fingers against her 4 clawed digits. In that moment, as the Wanderer sailed toward safety, David understood that they had become more than a human and an alien sharing a ship. They had become a team. A family. The free colonies appeared on David's scanner like a constellation of hope scattered across the darkness of space. 3 space stations orbited a terraformed moon, each one gleaming with lights and activity. Ships of 1,000 different designs moved between the stations, representatives from 100 different species, all living together in a place where freedom was not just a promise but a reality. After months of traveling through dangerous space, rationing food, and holding their breath every time a sensor picked up an unknown signal, they had finally arrived. David brought the Wanderer into the docking sequence for Colonial Station 7, the largest of the 3 stations. As the ship descended toward the docking bay, Vera stood beside him on the bridge, her 4 arms crossed in a gesture that David had learned meant cautious optimism. Her bioluminescent stripes glowed softly, a pale blue that seemed to reflect her mixed emotions. Behind them, Mex, Kale, and Sarah played on the floor, their tiny bodies rolling and tumbling together in the low gravity of the docking approach. The ship settled into its berth with a gentle clang of metal on metal. Alarms and warning lights blinked on the console, indicating that the docking mechanism had secured properly. David took a deep breath and looked at Vera. She looked back at him, and in her golden eyes, he saw the same mixture of fear and hope that he felt in his own heart. "We are here," Vera said softly, her voice improved over the months of constant practice. "We are safe." "We are safe," David repeated, though he knew that safety in the free colonies was relative. There would be paperwork, questions, officials who would want to know everything about who they were and where they had come from. But at least here no one would be enslaved. At least here no one would be considered property. David and Vera gathered the kittens and made their way to the airlock. The children clung to their mother's fur, their eyes wide with wonder and fear as they prepared to set paw on solid ground for the first time in their lives. Mex, ever the brave one, poked his small head through the airlock first, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of the station. The air smelled of recycled atmosphere mixed with dozens of different food sources and the metallic tang of machinery. The customs officer who greeted them at the station entrance was a Tarantian, a crystalline being whose body reflected light in rainbow patterns. The officer's multiple optical sensors focused on David and his small alien family with what seemed like curiosity rather than suspicion. The Tarantian made a series of harmonic sounds, which were translated by a universal translator into standard human language. "Welcome to the free colonies," the Tarantian said. "I am Officer Krell. I see you have traveled quite far. May I inquire about your origin and purpose?" David stepped forward, his hand resting gently on Vera's shoulder. "My name is David Chen. This is Vera and her 3 children. They are from the planet Phalith. We have come seeking refuge and asylum from the Valerian Collective." The Tarantian's optical sensors brightened. "Phalith? Yes, we have received reports of the Valerian occupation of that world. The Collective's crimes against your species are well documented in our records. You will have no difficulty obtaining asylum status here." As the officer processed their paperwork, David felt a wave of relief wash over him. The nightmare was truly over. Vera and her kittens were free. They would not be hunted. They would not be enslaved. They could begin to build a new life. Over the following weeks, David and Vera worked through the bureaucratic processes required to establish themselves in the free colonies. They were assigned a residential unit in a sector of the station designated for families with mixed species. The unit was small but clean, with separate sleeping areas and a common space where they could gather together. For the first time in months, they were not confined to the tight corridors of the Wanderer. David applied for a position with the Colonial Salvage Authority, using his years of experience to secure a role as a salvage coordinator. The work was similar to what he had been doing before, but now he had a home to return to at the end of each day. He had a reason to come back safe. He had people who depended on him. Vera, meanwhile, caught the attention of the Colonial Education Authority. Her knowledge of Valerian mining technology and her quick intelligence made her a valuable resource. She began working as a consultant, helping human and alien engineers understand the mechanisms and systems used by the collective. The work was meaningful to her. It felt like taking what the Valorians had forced her to learn and using it for good instead of for conquest and exploitation. But the most significant development came when representatives from the colonial government approached David and Vera with a proposal. They wanted to establish a settlement for the survivors of Phalith, a place where Vera's people could rebuild their civilization. The government had located 3 other survivors of the Valerian attacks, including an elder named Torin who had been instrumental in preserving the cultural knowledge of their species. Vera wept when she learned this news. She held her kittens close and spoke to them in her native language, telling them stories of their homeworld that would help them understand their heritage. Her bioluminescent stripes glowed bright with emotion, filling the small residential unit with beautiful blue light. The settlement was established on a moon orbiting the Free Colony's primary planet. The government provided resources and technology to help the Phalith survivors begin rebuilding. Within 6 months there were permanent structures in place. A school was built so that Vera's kittens and others of their kind could learn and grow. A community center was established where the survivors could gather and share their memories and traditions. One evening, as the 2 of them stood on the observation platform overlooking the settlement, David placed his arm around Vera's waist. She placed one of her 4 arms around his shoulders in return. They stood together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. Below them, Mex, Kale and Sarah played with other young Phalith, their laughter echoing across the settlement. "Thank you," Vera said softly. "Thank you for choosing to save us. Thank you for becoming our family." David looked at her, at this remarkable being who had taught him how to live again after he thought his heart was permanently broken. "No," he said. "Thank you for teaching me that love is worth the risk. That hope is worth fighting for." They stood together in silence, watching their children play, knowing that the scars of the past would always remain but that the future was finally, genuinely bright. David thought of his wife Helen and his daughter Sophie, wondering if somehow they could see him now, could see that he had learned to love again, had found a new family among the stars. The Valerian collective would never answer for their crimes. The suffering of countless enslaved beings would never be fully repaid. But here, in this moment, David understood that redemption was possible. That the choice to care for another life, to sacrifice for those who could not save themselves, was the truest expression of what it meant to be human. Or perhaps, he thought, watching Vera's bioluminescent stripes pulse gently beside him, it was not about being human at all. It was about being alive. It was about recognizing the value in another consciousness, another heart, another soul, and choosing compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation. The Wanderer still sat in its berth at the station, a reminder of the journey that had brought them here. But David and Vera no longer felt the need to wander. They had found their horizon. They had found their home. And in the darkness of space that surrounded the Free Colonies, countless other stories were unfolding, countless other beings discovering that survival was possible, that hope could flourish even in the coldest and darkest places, as long as there was at least one other being willing to reach out and say, "You matter. Your life matters. I will fight for you."